Okay, good. So let me briefly introduce you. Priyanka Jha, did I pronounce correctly? Jha, Assistant Professor, School of Undergraduate and Gender Studies in Ahmedabad University in India. But it's also stated in the program institution in Denmark. Are you now in India or in Denmark presently? You are in Denmark or in?
I was in Denmark. Now I'm back to India. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Priyanka, if I get it correctly, your main focus of interest is political philosophy, and you're mostly doing in the field of political philosophy. You're working in on the key women thinkers of modern South Asia and the definition of the normative in the nation through her works of ideas. You have been a junior fellow at the Max Weber Center for Advanced Social and Cultural Studies at the University of Erfurt in Germany, and engaging in with politics of culture and religion, focusing on emancipation, political Buddhism, all very interesting topics. And we are very much looking toward your presentation of global gendered intellectual history. Please.
Thank you so much. So at the onset of my presentation, I would like to thank IAPh, University of Paderborn, for giving me this opportunity to share some of the ideas that I've been most recently working on. And one of the central domains of my work and research in the present time focuses on the pursuits of global gendered intellectual history of ideas. So we know that intellectual history of ideas as a field has been moving towards a certain element of globality, whereby voices, ideas from the non-West is being invoked as central voices along with the existing body of research on what can be seen as thinking or what could be seen as sites of investigation. However, one of the big questions with which my presentation starts is how much ground has intellectual history of ideas or global intellectual history of ideas succeeded in becoming inclusive by bringing in a gendered predicament. And when I say gendered predicament, I mean the voices of women thinkers. And one understands that there is an element of major missing gap, whereby, yes, the surface is being scratched and we are trying to bring in women thinkers, but unfortunately, this still remains to be a very Eurocentric and transatlantic kind of experience, because we understand and we realize and recognize that it is absent by a very strong form of knowledge which has come to us in the form of post-colonialism. So what we understand is, A, there's already a lack of it being gendered, and secondly, when it is the pursuit of being gendered is still situated in certain frames, in certain positionalities, in certain geography, which has failed to bring in experiences, voices, and ideas of the post-colonial world. And by post-colonial world, I centrally bring India because that's my immediate location, India and South Asia. But I would also want to invoke experiences of the African continent and also the Latin American experiences. Saying that, what do I mean by something as post-colonial, gendered, global intellectual history of ideas? So by posing this particular title, what I am trying to argue, and I would be arguing during the course of my paper, is to bring in and invoke women voices from the non-West. It can be problematic, and I'm ready to take that up in my responses later during the discussion about the category of the West is also being challenged, and also the notion of it being fragmented. So now when there are pursuits of fragmenting the monolithic idea of West, it is also very important to fragment the idea of the post-colonial, because in each of these societies, their experiences and their interactions with colonialism, and therefore a certain trope of modernity coming in through colonialism, which is referred to as colonial modernity, in case of South Asia, was distinct within the post-colonial world. And in this, what really happened was the manner in which knowledge went to be constructed, epistemology was being framed, it was framed from a very lopsided, male-centric kind of perspective. So in 1947, for example, India attained independence. But we succeeded in creating a certain kind of a setup which was decolonized. But again, a very important question which has emerged from a lot of African sources as well, whether we've been successful in terms of decolonizing our minds. And unfortunately, the answer is no. Because if we look at the larger pedagogy, if we look at the larger syllabus, if we look at the larger curriculum, we understand that there is this major sort of colonial hangover still existing. So what I would share is a personal experience, because as a student of political science, so what we do in India, we do not have intellectual history of ideas per se as a discipline, but we study that in the form of political thought. Now, when we read political thought, so as a student who was majoring in political thought, and now as a teacher, this journey of 15 years, there's been this constant struggle of not finding adequate Indian thinkers. And even if there was a pursuit from 1970s with the larger theme of decolonizing universities, decolonizing our minds, we successfully managed to bring in thinkers. But unfortunately, a large corpus of this thinking was drawn from male thinking, from male thinkers. Now, this kind of problem has many consequences. This is definitely a problem for me because A, there is eclipsing of women voices. B, there is eclipsing of subjectivities. And thirdly, positionalities, because if you look at the larger field of knowledge, women are simply invisibilized. Or even if they are brought in now with a lot of serious pursuits, whether coming from feminist historians or from thinkers who've been involved in literary critiques, or for that matter, setting up a women's studies and, of course, the women's movement, we've managed to bring in some women thinkers. But the kind of rigor that is required is still missing. Now, that is not a problem simply of the post-colonial societies, but this is something that keeps coming up while attending conversations or participating in debates, that this is this myopic kind of male-centric perspective of knowledge on thinking is something which is like a universal phenomenon. But with the post-colonial societies, there is another problem. The problem is that despite this pursuit of gendering political thought or gendering knowledge, we are still very much engaging with women thinkers from West. If you look at the syllabus, if you look at the curriculum, some of the most important voices, and thank God that we have these voices because they were one of the first people to create a certain kind of consciousness amongst us to think about, philosophy or history or political science, social sciences and humanities from a gendered perspective through the works of Mary Wollstonecraft, Simone de Beauvoir, Hannah Arendt. These are very important sort of vantage point for us. But unfortunately, we've not been able to provide enough attention to women thinkers from these societies. Now, looking at the reasons as to why there has been this kind of gap, is it that women were not writing here? Is it that women philosophers did not exist in these societies? Or the bigger challenge that adequate attention was never given to these ideas, to these thinkings, and to their frameworks? And if we were to, and now like sort of centering the problem, if I want to look at what have been the possible ways through which we've managed to bring in these women thinkers, we would understand that there has been four major sort of contributions. And these four contributions came from a major intervention that started with feminist historians in India, arguing that the manner in which history was written and the manner in which history was provided to us gave this notion that this movement for nationalist struggle for independence was largely led by men. But this was just the national, and this is something that is a major theme, whether we look at, because history is written from so many perspectives and there's so many schools of thought which has provided this sense of history, at least, I mean, with regard to India, whether it's the nationalist school of thought, or whether it's the Cambridge school of thought, or the subaltern school of thought, which speaks on marginalities and the outliers of the history actors. So feminist interventions were very, very central in terms of reclaiming these acts of serious commitment, whether in the form of bringing to us the contribution of thinkers like Pandita Ramabai, Savitribai Phule, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. It's very interesting because when I was listening to the presentation previously about I don't know if I can pronounce her name correctly, Ellie Lambridis, and her active participation in the socialist circle post Second World War. And it's so interesting because Kamala Devi was doing the same thing. She was one of the first leading socialist feminists raising not just the question of colonialism, because she actively participated in the national movement, but also post-independence, whereby she went on to play such an important role in working towards the revival of arts and craft, decentralized development, or her writings on socialism. So you can actually find a lot of parallels about what is happening in two parts of the world. And so these feminist historians like Uma Chakravarti, Kumkum Sangari, Tanika Sarkar, Uma Chakravarti were central in terms of not just retrieving and finding these sources for us in terms of women writing, women thinkers, but also in terms of finding organizations. See, one of the major arguments that the nationalist historians sort of presented was on the front of social reforms. And a lot of social reforms regarding the women question were sort of presented as emanating from benevolence of the imperial regimen, the British Raj, along with the male social leaders, the male social reformers. Now, the problem is that if this trope of history is considered as the normative one, it eclipses the contribution of some of the women thinkers that I just mentioned, and the organizations and the struggles that they waged for the social reforms on the question of child marriage, on the question of widow remarriage, on the question of education. So there was an entire field which kind of informs us about the contribution of these brilliant women thinkers and the kind of challenges that they face. So a lot of gains that we feminists in India right now has not come through the benevolence of the male social reformers or male leaders, or the British Empire, but it came through active participation of these women thinkers. Now, if this act is not taken into consideration, it has major sort of impact on how we consider women, because there's been this larger portrayal of women as the recipient of change, as Gerda Lerner in Creation of Patriarchy brings. And I want to mention two quotes by her. She writes, "The great forgetting, selective memory, has a special significance for women. Women are half of humankind. They've always carried out half of world's work and duties and have been active agents in history. Yet in the recorded history, they have only appeared as marginal contributors to human development." Another quote, "Men similarly miseducated through a distorted image of the past have been reinforced in their culturally created sense of superiority and the conviction that a sex-based division of labor justifies male dominance." So this whole idea of women as recipient, women as not really participant or active producers of change is something that feminist historiography played a very important role in debunking, and also kind of prepared the ground for us to now think of women as intellectual producers, women as producers of ideas and thinkers. Now, the second was the setting up of large number of women's studies and centers. This was important because the whole idea of looking at events, looking at processes, looking at knowledge from a gendered perspective was a significant contribution of these women's studies and women gender studies centers which were brought up. But the irony of the situation is that even to this day, they are not really considered as important interlocutors with regard to the idea of women in history or women in political processes or women in economic processes. But yet we need to, like at least in the Indian and South Asian kind of context, we really need to understand their contribution in doing that. Women who were engaging with literary work. Now, this was a major, major contribution because for the first time, women body of work, whether it was creative writing, it was not just academic writing, but women as poets, women as storytellers, women as writers, and the manner in which they were looking at social conditions, the manner in which they were looking at social reality had huge consequences because it led to questioning a lot of things. For example, what do we consider as a canon? Do we only take philosophical texts as canon? So there was a lot of contribution of these literary critiques producing another way of looking at what can be considered as the canon. Is it only the written word which needs to be celebrated? Or what about women who did not write, or women who were not trained to write? So who do we consider as a thinker? And also like a lot of re-questioning of what can be considered as a body of work. What is it? Because one of the most important ideas in while reading a text, whether we would want to take Skinner or Koselleck, at least in the intellectual history tradition, is the privilege of the written word. Now, when we look at women thinkers, there are other sides that starts opening up. And these are the sides of the creative. These are the sides of aesthetic. These are the sides which actually challenges that thinking is not a lettering process. It's not a lettered process. Thinking is an intellectual process, and that can be represented in so many multifaceted ways. Now, when we look at intellectual history of ideas and the global intellectual history of ideas, somewhere it is falling short of really making it agendered. And when I'm saying gendered, also like the experiences of the other kinds, experience of women who were thinking and imagining very, very differently. Because if I want to take one of the cardinal sort of framework with which global intellectual history is working with, if I want to take Sam Moyens and Andrew Sartori's work, who've been arguing about the need for making intellectual history of ideas global. And there are three major frameworks of positionality, temporality, and subjectivity. Now, positionality is very, very important. But unfortunately, when we look at the global intellectual history of ideas, it is replete with the positionality of the post-colonial world and post-colonial women thinkers. So now, if this is the framework, if this is the question, if this is the larger sort of context in which I want to position post-colonial gendered global intellectual history of ideas, what is it that we can do? And over a period of time, just engaging with the students, I have come across certain ways in which we can do it. And there are 5 major frameworks in which I believe, from my experience, that we can actually work towards making the post-colonial global gendered intellectual history of ideas a success. The first is redrafting the curriculum. So a lot of universities in the post-colonial world will have to shrug off the colonial kind of vestiges of knowledge. We really need to decolonize our mind. And the only way to decolonize, one of the ways of decolonizing our mind is decolonizing what we are teaching, what we are engaging, what we are giving to the students and the researchers, which means that, which is related to the second point of syllabus revision. So in India, we either have an annual syllabus revision or we have a biannual syllabus revision. But unfortunately, many a times during these revisions, the working with the expert mentality, and largely these experts are the men. I mean, no offenses to the ones attending here, but, and I don't want to sound like a feminazi, and I mean, thinking can be done, but unfortunately, because there is this overall patriarchal sort of mold with which our academics is not really going away, it just feels that this hold is just so strong. And when we are revising the syllabus, I think it is a very important, it would be very, very important to bully the way in terms of bringing more women thinkers, bringing in more women ideas, engaging with thinkers. We will have to sort of also question the way we look at knowledge, as I was mentioning previously, that it's not just the written word. So coming across with poetess and writers who've been engaging, so finding creative sources. One of the recent I was recently involved in a syllabus revision for an entire state in India where I'm presently based. And it actually, initially, there was a lot of resistance, but by the end of the deliberations, it was very nice because they did not accept all the names, but they accepted 50% of the names. And from the next semester, these students for the first time would be introduced to women thinkers as part of political thinking and ideas in India. So if we all, like at our own levels, try to use the opportunity when we are in the board of studies, when we are in our syllabus committees and working, we should really work towards that. Thirdly, creating archives and translating more work. So as you know that India is a multilingual country and there's so many languages. So women were writing in a lot of languages, but unfortunately, we use English as a medium of instruction, like other British ex-colonies. So a lot more work to be translated so that the access, the accessibility of the ideas through reading their work. So a systematic effort on part of most of us, whoever knows whatever language, to sort of translate that and create more archives. If you look at the historical archives right now, unfortunately, is male narratives, kind of skipping women organization or women's speeches or women contribution. So kind of reclaim that and create more archives, reconstructing the historical archive, without which a lot of research can't really take place. So in terms of reclaiming the archives and infiltrating the archives with more women voices, more and more translation. Gerda Lerner talks about women-centered history. I would use her framework and I would say move towards women-centered intellectual history of ideas. So when I say women-centered intellectual history of ideas, is to look at these ideas, is to look at these concepts and try to trace them with women thinkers. I'm not saying that it solely has to be a women thinking kind of a project, but any other project that we do, it is always interesting to get some women voices. I mean, of late, I've started doing that. So I've been working on the concept of equality in the post-colonial thinking. So it was very interesting because I thought I would bring in Kamala Devi as one of the interlocutors. And it was so interesting because her position on inequality and equality was just so fascinating, because all the other male thinkers decided to omit the gender aspect of inequality. So I'm not saying that it has to be, you only have to be a woman to be able to do that. Anyone can do that. But unfortunately, the omissions have been so long drawn that it is time that we have these women thinkers, not just as interlocutors, but also as conversation partners. And the last, more research on women thinkers. Unfortunately, at least in South Asia, I've been speaking to some of my colleagues in other universities, the kind of research, so we do research on gender policies, we look at processes, we look at participation, we do a lot of things from a gendered perspective, but I think when it comes to women intellectual history, women philosophy, it is still not there, it is still missing. So one way could be to encourage more research. This is something that I've started doing, and it's so interesting with some of the PhD students. And it's so interesting because they've come back and told me that they suffer from a lot of challenges. And one of the major challenges is to not get enough research material on these thinkers. And the whole point that there is the lacuna of the material is precisely because these topics have not been researched, these thinkers have not been engaged with. Because one of the last things with which I would like to end my presentation is is this question that, if we engage with women thinkers, would we have a different understanding of the normativity? Would we have a different understanding of the concepts? Would we have a different understanding of the larger reality, which is posed as the normative reality? Because, during the keynotes and that I've been attending, and a lot of lectures that I was listening to, presentations, one of this major sort of conjecture in all these presentations have been the missing voice. And, even if we are deliberating, right now in India, we're still like 80 years old as a post-colonial independent nation, but the kind of attention on 50% of the thinking, and this is not something that only happened in the modern time. If you look at evolution of India as a society, right from the ancient times, one of the first lawgivers were women, Gargi and Maitri, and the rule of law was based, at least the property rights were based on their theorization. But unfortunately, they have just disappeared. They've just been invisibilized. And when we walk, like at least in South Asia, there's a lot of culture of public figures, images all over, or the bust. It would be interesting to sort of go onto a lane and see how many women thinkers really find that kind of place. Like if you find Gandhi is everywhere, and Gandhi was central, and so were a lot of other male thinkers. But it is next to impossible to find a woman thinker's bust, like a statue dedicated to her. So that just tells us about the larger way of thinking on this. And so gendered global intellectual history from a post-colonial perspective adds not just knowledge and vigor, but also helps us rethinking the way we've been doing history of ideas or the way we've been doing philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Priyanka. It was very, very nice, very interesting presentation. And
so, hi everyone, I'm Ivana, and I'm going to introduce to you Luka Borsic. It is my pleasure to introduce Luka. He's my friend and colleague from the Institute of Philosophy in Zagreb in Croatia. His main interests are ancient philosophy, Renaissance philosophy, and of course, women in philosophy. Currently, he is the director of the Institute of Philosophy, and he will be talking about women in let me see, Southeast Europe until 20th century. So, Luka, please.
yeah, okay, guys. Sorry for those movements. We are sitting on one computer and changing computers here. Let me. Actually, I will have a talk that will be divided in several parts, several ways. First, I'm actually going to, and what I'm going to bring to you are actually the problems of writing history of women philosopher in Southeast European context. So first thing I want to mention is a problem of which is a desideratum, so to say. So something that we are really missing, and I think not just in the context of women philosophers in Southeast European context, but also in the context of generally European women philosophers. Namely, if you ask yourself a simple question, what about women's higher education in the past, you won't find any good textbook or sources on that. Occasionally, you will find some little notes here and there, right, on what happened in this on this place or what happened in that place, but you won't find any comprehensive, any sorry, I have something to fix about the view. Okay, sorry, yeah. So you won't find any comprehensive serious text that will deal with this problem. And this is when we speak about women philosophers, and the women educated? This was also the question I asked to Priyanka, and I don't know what is the situation in India nowadays. Do you have guys there some sort of comprehensive textbook on describing really what was the situation with women education in the past? But in Europe, we don't really have such a text, which is sort of surprising thing. So let me just briefly tell you, before coming to more precisely to the question of Southeast European women philosophers, what was the situation with education in Europe? So, before I start with this talk, let me just really mention, and I think Priyanka already mentioned that in the passage, and I think this is also very important. When we deal with women philosophers in the past, we have to be more inclusive than just looking at the official curricular institutional education, because otherwise, if you just look at institutionalized education, we would really end up with so few names or so few women philosophers, and not only that, it would be really because of the reasons known to all of us about women being forbidden to study, women being forbidden to go to universities, to schools, and so on. But also it would be wrong because there were many women who were not really educated in an institutionalized way, but nevertheless had very interesting things to say, and they wrote interesting things. And even if they were not strictly speaking philosophical, as we would now see them in institutions as they are taught nowadays, still the topics that would be that could be subsumed to the title philosophy in broader sense. So let me now start with some data. According to some stories, the first woman philosopher who was teaching and being educated at university was a woman in Bologna. Her name was Betizia Gozzadini. It was in the middle of 13th century. And then afterwards, so we have some other names. One is like Novella d'Andrea, and then there is his sister Bettina d'Andrea, who were teaching law and philosophy in Padua. Unfortunately, besides legends, besides stories, besides some short texts, not theirs, but about them, some grave monuments, we know nothing of them. We just have those names and a few legends, something like, for instance, that both Novella d'Andrea and Bettina d'Andrea were so beautiful that they had to wear a scarf above or put over their head, because if they didn't wear the scarf, if they showed their beautiful face, the male students would get so crazy or blinded by their beauty, they would not be able to study. And such stories, such completely ridiculous stories, of course, we have preserved. But besides those, we really don't have any kind of evidence about that. When we come to the 15th and 16th century, then of course you have, this is one of the waves of feminism. Usual European history of women philosophers is described by waves. You have certain periods when women were more prominent than in some other periods. Why is this the case? It's really kind of a longer story to answer, but this is what really happened. So in the 16th century, it's one of the peak of the waves. You have relatively many women engaged in philosophy, mostly in Italy and in Spain. And then in the second half of the 17th century, you have more women in the rest of the Europe. You have, for instance, Dutch Anna Maria van Schurman. Then you have in Germany Ursula Agricola. In Sweden, you have Maria Pilgrim and some other women philosophers. And of course, you have very much mentioned and very often mentioned Emily du Châtelet as one of very prominent French figure. Interestingly, when we come to the official education or institutionalized education of women in Europe, the first doctorate of philosophy was awarded to a French woman, Julie Victoire d'Aubier. Julie Victoire d'Aubier was the first. She received her PhD in 1861 from the University of Lyon in France. In 1860, it was 1861. In 1869, the 9 candidates were allowed to have an access to the exam, to the doctoral exam at University of London, and it was the first such an exam. In Germany, the situation was kind of more complicated. Only in 1870s, we have some sporadic inscription of women to certain universities, but in generally they didn't have rights to get a diploma, doctoral diploma until 1900s, and sometimes even later. In Vienna, for instance, only in 1897 it was allowed to women to enter the faculty of philosophy, and in only 1900s they opened the doors of Vienna University medical faculty, opened the doors to women. For instance, in Zagreb University, in my state, in Croatia, the first ordinary female students were in the year 1901, 1902, but Ivana is going to speak more about that. So here I skipped one important university that was actually the first one one of the first universities to give doctors to women, and this was University of Zurich in Switzerland. In 1864, the first female students who started receiving being accepted, and the first female students was a Russian in 1867 that she received a doctorate, and then from then on in Switzerland many women received doctoral degrees. University of Zurich is very proud of that, and if you go and check their website, you can find a special website just dedicated to women philosophers, and you will see a whole bunch of women philosophers, predominantly Russian women. But that sort of that goes a little bit beyond what I'm going to speak today, so I won't touch this. But in some texts, even and myself, we published together, you can read more about those the situation at the University of Zurich. Okay, by this relatively long introduction, I wanted to stress to you the situation, how the situation actually looked like in Europe. So until in late 19th century, women were practically not able to receive higher education, which means not only the fact that women were barred from getting institutionalized higher education, but it also means another thing. It means that only the upper class women were able to get any kind of education, because of course it was one of the practical conditions of being educated. One of the practical conditions of being educated is to have money. If you were poor, if you had to fight for even if you're a middle class woman, I guess, born in middle class, it was, however thin this middle class was in the past, it was almost impossible to get any kind of education. With this little background so let me go with my presentation, and I will now put some slides in front of you. So let me just present this. Okay, can you see this presentation? Is it on? Okay, so this part is we are Ivana, myself, and some other people. We founded the Research Center for Women in Philosophy in our institution. This is Institute of Philosophy in Zagreb. You're very welcome to visit our website, which is not yet complete, and but we are working on it. And we dedicated it's a part of the project called Croatian Women Philosophers in the European concept. But we go beyond just Croatian borders. We just founded this center, which is generally a research center for women in philosophy. So when we come to the question of women in Southeast Europe, so what is Southeast Europe? And this is one of the most controversial questions here, because Southeast Europe is more or less the map. I put it here, which includes portion of Slovenia, then portion of Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Kosovo, Montenegro, Macedonia, Albania, and Greece. It is very, very troubled concept. it kind of coincides with the mountains called the Balkan Mountains. If you look at the map, you see all those mountains. It's historical question. Of course, it opens very many problems regarding the history of this period. Of course, one banal reason is that Europe is very strangely, oddly shaped continent, so it's really hard to divide it, but this is really just a geographical fact. One of the issues that regards here, this is the map from how Europe looked like in late 4th century AD, when the Emperor Theodosius divided the Roman Empire into the East and West Roman Empire, and the border between East and West went directly here, as you can see, or he dividing culturally West Roman Empire and culturally East that later on become Greek dominated and then Orthodox Christian dominated, and West that was Latin dominated and then Catholic dominated. So, and this division, however long time ago it was 1,600 years ago, this division, but still it is very much sort of culturally, historically, even from the point of view of mentality, divides at least this southeast countries. So when you ask people here, do we belong to the Balkans, which is another name for Southeast European, those countries which are here painted in green would be happy eventually to say yes. And but those countries which are painted in green, in red, would be very reluctant to admit being part of the Balkans. For instance, let me just give you sort of fun example. A year ago, we organized workshop in Croatia called similar to this, the Women Philosophers of Southeast Europe. And when we invited people from women philosophers from Bulgaria, Macedonia, Greece, Serbia, or Bosnia, they're all gladly accepted to participate. But when we sent invitation to the Romania, they pretended they have nothing to do with this, as though they don't belong to this area. They are not really part of this whole of the whole story of what is happening here. So because the word Balkans, as I'm going to tell you quickly, has a very dubious and very strange reputation. Why is that? Let me start again from some funny text that was written 1,600 years ago by Pseudo Caesarius in Edda Topocrates, which was one of the most famous and widely disseminated texts of the medieval world, composed in the 5th and late 6th century, and which illustrates the problem of how the people who lived in this area were received from very early periods, from early Middle Ages, and then this sort of curse or this sort of descriptions kept on hanging on. So look at this text. In this part of the world are to be found the Slavs and the Physonites, also called Danubians. I couldn't locate those Physonites, but okay. The former take pleasure in eating women's breasts filled with milk, and they break newborn babies against rocks like mice. The latter, on the other hand, avoid consuming even meat which can be eaten lawfully and without any reproach. The one are insubordinate, independent, wreck no master, and frequently care their chieftains when at table or traveling. They eat foxes, boar, and call out each other with wolf cries. I mean, when you have such people, you don't simply do business with them. And this sort of reputation of Balkans being wild, horrible, unpleasant, dangerous, warlike area is what remained. And still, if you check Collins' English dictionary, the Balkans, there is a verb to balkanize or to balkanize, intransitive meaning to divide the territory into small warring states or to divide the group of organizations into small factions. So this is how this area is perceived. I spend a lot of time now talking to you about this history, and this is to explain why practically before 20th century there is hardly to find any woman philosopher. Because simply this area of the world is the Balkan area. On the one hand, it is characterized by a state of almost perpetual wars, beginning from the very early history until recently, and also by the relatively high mountains, which were hardly passable or surpassable, which were hardly accessible, and for some reasons, and if you look at the whole area, it was almost until Croatia here, so the upper left corner, it was occupied by the Ottoman Empire from the 16th century onwards, or had some sort of semi-independence or this kind of independence, depending on the state and depending on the period. All those periods were, so throughout the history, while in the Western Europe and some Eastern states. I'm happy here to greet Dagmar. Dagmar is one of the authors of the wonderful book on Czech women philosophers, recently published. So hello, Dagmar. And of course, the Slavic situation in the Czech Republic, which is northern from here, is completely different historically. And while Czech Republic or to Czechia nowadays is territory where throughout the history a lot of culture was blossoming, and they were one of the focal points of in the 16th century education. Contrary to that, unfortunately, this period, this part of the world was very troubled, very warlike, and very bloody history. And of course, as the famous Latin proverb says, "Inter arma silent muse." So when the weapons are clinging, the muses, the education is silent. So this was unfortunately the situation here, except for a small oasis you can see along the Croatian coast, because Croatian coast, that's on the upper left side of the slide. The Croatian coast, what is nowadays Croatian coast, was very much influenced by the Italian culture and Italian civilization throughout history, and they kind of they kind of succeeded in keeping their independence by giving gold to the Ottoman Empire, and for this reason they remained to a large degree independent. And those little oases like Dubrovnik, Ragusa, next to the border with Montenegro or so, there you have some throughout history. Now more educated people. All I'm talking about now is until the 20th century, when Ivana will start speaking after me. Of course, the situation was very different. Ottoman Empire was lost. We had our own independent states and so on and so on. So the education started going different way. Okay, so after this very, very long introduction, I actually wanted to give you example of very briefly in the last 10 minutes of my talk of how to deal with women philosophers in the area where there are so few educated people throughout history. If they were educated, they were only men, of course, or mostly men, and if they were educated, they were mostly priests most of the time, except some little periods like Renaissance and then later on 20th century, which is not anymore the object of my topic, when we have some little spark, little comets of some women who did philosophy and who did some educated stuff. Of course, again, I'm here recalling what Priyanka was saying, and this is something also the leitmotif of my year-long research and Ivana's as well. We have to be definitely, if we want to approach this history, we have to approach the intellectual history of ideas of this period from more inclusive perspective than we are used to when we deal with, let's say, French philosophy or German philosophy or English philosophy. You can be stricter when doing with those, let's say, big nations in history and philosophy than when you're dealing with people who have hardly any any people. Of course, a caveat or something that I should have mentioned before, I'm skipping completely antiquity. Greek antiquity and what happened there is completely different story. So I'm actually speaking about what happened from Middle Ages onwards. So the ancient Greek women philosophers is of course a very different story and very big story, but it's different and it has nothing to do with this present talk. Okay, and now the question is, when you have such a territory, when you have such a troubled states practically without much written material, so how do you find women philosophers? It's very different type of work than when you study Émilie de Châtelet and then you have a whole bunch of manuscripts and then you go to St. Petersburg or you go to Paris and then you do the manuscripts, or you have published books and then or even when you do modern people, just modern women philosophers, you just open, you buy the books and then you study. Here you have no books, you have nothing. I mean, you just first you have to discover books, you have to discover texts, and that of course requires a very different type of kind of work and a very different approach. I'm actually going to talk about one woman philosopher whose works are some of works are published, some of works are published by her husband, and some of works that were and most of it is not published and seemingly does not exist. Why I say seemingly it does not exist, because I spent some time going into the archives, going to the libraries, trying to discover some manuscripts and I was not able to find any. Of course, maybe if I had 10 years of my time, of my life to spend, maybe I could discover something, but within this limited period of my time, I was not able to discover more. So the woman philosopher I'm just going briefly to present to you is called, in Croatian, Maruša Gundulić, or in Italian version, Maria Gondola. She was from Dubrovnik, and of course they spoke Italian in 16th century, so she had a Croatian name, Slavic name, and then she has Italian name. We know very little about her, that she was born in 1557 in Ragusa, in noble family of Gondola. Of course, if she wanted to be educated, she had to be highest nobility, otherwise there was no question of being educated. She married another nobleman called in Italian Nicolò Vito di Gozza, in Croatian Nicola Vito Vučetić. And we have two works, one work published by her and the other which is published by her husband, and I claim it's actually her book. However, interestingly, even those few women that we have, we are conscious by some other women philosophers doing history of women philosophers, it was rejected for funny reasons. So let me give you an example. It was written by Virginia Cox, one very prominent historian of women philosophy, in a book Women in Italian Renaissance Culture and Society. When she mentions those dialogues written by her husband, it should be noted that although the author, husband Vučetić, presents his work as a documentary dialogue, the speaker somehow bizarre names, Maria Gondola and Fiore Zuzuri, raise suspicion about their existence. I have not been able to identify either of them. This just shows a lousy lousy history of philosophy work done by otherwise excellent historian of philosophy, Virginia Cox. So what she did, she actually found some dialogues written by her husband, and found that they're published, they're printed in 16th century, and she found the name of the interlocutors of the dialogue, namely Maria Gondola and Fiore Zuzuri, and Virginia Cox thought that those names sounded to her ear so bizarre that she suspected that those people could not exist. They are fictional characters. Of course, if she did some more serious research, if she were more serious in how do scholarly work, she would realize that behind those names, they are really existing people. Maria Gondola is Maruša Vučetić, and Fiore Zuzuri is Cvjeta Zuzurić. So two very prominent intellectuals, philosophers. The second one was actually a poet from Dubrovnik of the 16th century. Just check the time. Okay, I have 3 more minutes left. I said there was one, she published one extremely interesting feminist manifesto, we can say, and it was published as a preface of a book written by her husband. So you see the title page here. It is a book on Aristotle, on some Aristotelian questions. And as a preface of this book, they included a letter called in which, as you can see on the third part of the slide, Maria Gondola, so Marusia Gucci, signed the letter in which she defends the honor of her friend who was unjustly attacked by the citizens of Dubrovnik, of Raguja here. And she defends not only the honor of her friend, but also in an interesting way, she defends not only the equality of women towards men, but also superiority. She argues for the superiority of women over men. And let's not forget, it's 16th century. She wrote a very interesting text arguing for superiority of women over men. And since I dedicated most of my time of giving you the context, I won't really have time now to go into details. Here I am actually just giving you examples of how we approach women philosophers in the past. She has five arguments here. One is the argument, she's kind of twisting Platonic argument that if women are more beautiful than men and they are generally considered to be more beautiful than men, then it means they also have a better soul. That she has some ontological argument that if women are desired for various reasons, then it means they have a sort of teleological, they serve as a final cause, as a causa finalis, and such since the final cause is the highest, the most noble of causes, then women are more noble than men. She has a very interesting linguistical, social, philosophical approach, which I'm not going to enter into. It has something to do with Italian stuff. It's kind of complicated, and for the sake of time, I'm going to skip it. She has also a biological argument, and this is very interesting. She's twisting this Aristotelian argument by saying if women are more morbid, softer than men, then it means if you take this Aristotelian approach to physiology, then it also means that by being softer, by being more morbid, they're also more impressible, and being more impressible means being able to take more knowledge. And since by sort of constitution, women are more open to knowledge and then men who are harder and stiffer, and of course then it's harder to stick some knowledge to men than to women, according to this argument. And I have, I think, 1 minute left. Yeah. Okay, in this 1 minute, I'm just going to mention so this is in this sort of letter, the dedicatory letter or manifesto, proto-feminist manifesto, proto-radical feminist manifesto, we could say, she defended the honor of women. And then, interestingly, there were two dialogues written by her husband in which, as I mentioned before, Fiore Zuzori, as you see on the third slide, and Maria Gondola are interlocutors. In the secondary literature, you can find some text written on these dialogues. There are two dialogues, one on love, the other on beauty. And all of them, all secondary literature, claims that those dialogues were written by her husband and that the characters are just present his own ideas. So he used the name of his wife and her friend to present his own ideas on Platonic idea of beauty and so on and so on. And in my work, I'm claiming, and in my research, I claim that there is no reason to do so. We can take it literally. We can take the position that he was the writer, whereas the authors, the owners of the ideas, were actually those two women. There is no reason for us not to think that the ideas presented in those dialogues belong to the historical figures of Maria Gondola, his wife, and her friend Fiore Zuzori. And they, similarly to what we have in early Platonic dialogues, where Plato is presenting the ideas of historical Socrates, of course, Plato is writing them down. Socrates did not write anything here. Similarly to that, although Maria Gondola did not write those dialogues, she might be considered the author of those ideas. And I spent a lot of pages dedicated to this, to trying to prove this situation here. Just at the end of my talk, I will show you, these are some photos from Dubrovnik, from the villa. Their villa of Maria Gondola and her husband Niccolo Gozze. It still exists. It looks like nowadays like this. If you saw the Game of Thrones, it was filmed here in this villa. Some portions of the Game of Thrones, and it is Arboretum. There is a beautiful garden here, and those dialogues take place in 16th century in those gardens. And if you happen to come to Croatia, and you're very welcome to visit those places, those Renaissance palace and the Game of Thrones place here, where this philosophical dialogue took place, with one of the earliest defense of women's honor. And so I stop here. I think I'm just spent my half an hour. I'm sorry. I purposefully wanted to dedicate most of my talk to the giving context of how different type of study is to study early women philosophers in certain geographic area. So I guess for this reason I say my talk very nicely fits to Priyanka, although Priyanka is dealing with completely different geographic area, but still facing similar issues, similar problems of how to start, because it's very different to study Croatian women philosophers and maybe early Indian female philosophers than to study German female philosophers. It's very, very different type of work. So I will finish here, and thank you for your attention. Yeah, and of course, if there's some, we don't really have time for questions, I think, and so we can just simply continue. And I will here use opportunity to introduce my friend and colleague, one of the co-founders of our Center for Research of Women in Philosophy. You just saw her face a few minutes ago, and now she is coming back again to this computer, and she will continue with more substantial talk than mine. Mine was more general, but she will continue with concrete women philosophers in Southeast Europe in the 20th century, from 20th century onwards. So I'm very happy to welcome Ivana Skuhala Karasman to give her speech.
So, hello everyone once again. I will be talking about women philosophers in Southeast Europe. I think Luka wanted to talk also about Helene Drušković, but he had no time. I didn't plan to talk about Helene Drušković, but I will say a few words about her too, because she's the first woman philosopher from Croatia background who earned her PhD degree in University of Zurich, and she's also very prominent feminist, and she wrote one very important work about one utopia where women and men should live in the different sides of one city. She's unfortunately best known as a woman who had some relationship, some authors claim love affair with Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher. So I won't go into details anymore, although Helene Drušković is very interesting feminist and philosopher. Luka and me are writing book about her, so in English, so you will have opportunity to read more about her. I'm starting to talk about women philosophers in Southeast Europe in 20th century. When you talk about women in Southeast Europe, you have to take into account that most of these women lived and were educated in the communist system. Well, for living in the communist system, women and men had always the same opportunity to be educated, but also this country were very rural and traditional, so many women didn't have any opportunity to get schooled. I will start with first philosopher Elza Kučera. And she's in Croatia best known as the first woman librarian, and also as the first women psychologist. but she also obtains a PhD degree from University of Zurich about Thomas Brown. Of course, nobody knows today who Thomas Brown was or is, but at the time he was very popular topic on for writing a PhD thesis. Her thesis was published in 1909, and this is the only philosophical work that she wrote. She mostly was engaged in psychology, in experimental psychology, but in her works on psychology, she also included some philosophical elements. She had a very lot of friends and women friends, and one of them is Slovenian woman philosopher Alma Sodnik. Slovenia is a little bit north of Croatia. Alma Sodnik was born and lived and studied in Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia. And for their correspondence, it can be concluded that they were very close. They call each other Schwesterzellen, so it means sisters at heart and sisters of soul. In their letters, apart from everyday things and events that worried them, such as Kučera calls them difficult times, she meant the time at the Second World War. They also write about philosophy. Thus, in a letter dated March the 2nd, 1954, Kučera wrote, "Well, then the development of your philosophical literature from the 16th century to the present day, this will be the basis of the history of our philosophy, which no one in the Balkan has yet." So Elza Kučera had this idea to write one history of Croatian philosophy, what is, of course, very interesting, and she never did, but she started. There are some remarks about Croatian philosophy. And allegedly, Alma Sodnik wanted to do the same about Slovenian national philosophy. Elza Kučera was also a friend with a Serbian woman philosopher, a very famous philosopher in Serbia, Ksenija Atanasijević. She graduated from the University of Belgrade and also obtains a PhD degree from University of Belgrade. She was the first woman philosopher working at the Philosophical University in Belgrade. They were also corresponding not only about philosophy, but also about some feminist movement on the Balkan and on this place called ex-Yugoslavia, of course. The next philosopher that I want to introduce you, of course, I started with Croatian women philosophers because I'm a Croatian, so I use this opportunity to start with Croatian philosopher. The next Croatian woman philosopher I'd like to talk to you was Ivana Rossi. She also, like Elza Kučera, attended the Women Lyceum in Zagreb. The Women Lyceum in Zagreb was one very important educational institution in Croatia at that time, because it was first gymnasium for girls in Croatia, and after this lyceum they could go to the university and they get a very, very good education. In 1916, Ivana Rossi received her PhD in philosophy with a thesis, Basic Thought Philosophy by Henri Bergson at the Faculty of Philosophy in Zagreb. So she became the first woman to receive a doctorate in philosophy on that institution. Significantly, it is a time when Ivana Rossi wrote and defended her dissertation. Henri Bergson was on the peak of his work. She worked all her life as a gymnasium teacher, and she never published her dissertation or any other text. But she's in Croatia is mostly known as a translator of the book Peter Pan. And the next philosopher is Eli Ebenspanger. She was born in 1904 in Zagreb to a Jewish family. That is important to say. You will see why later on. She in 1926 at the Faculty of Philosophy in Zagreb, she graduated from the group of Roman languages, and she graduated later on philosophy. She received in 1939 her doctorate in philosophy with the thesis The Problem of Free Will. The dissertation is published the same year in Zagreb. In year 1942, being a Jew, she was interned in the Lobograd camp. It is a camp that was in Croatia at the time, and did most probably die the same year in Auschwitz. The next Croatian woman philosopher was born in 1912 in island of Brač, and her name is Marija Brida. She graduated philosophy at the University in Zagreb in 1935. 2 years later, in 1937, she received her doctorate degree with the thesis Life Experience. The dissertation was published in Zagreb in 1937. She worked at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in Zadar. And she organized at the same university an independent department of philosophy. She died in 1993, and she published 5 books in her lifetime. The second philosopher is a colleague of Marija Brida at the same university. Her name is Heda Festini, and she was born in 1928 in Osijek. She graduated from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in Zagreb, and she graduated South Slavic Literature, Philosophy, and Psychology. She received a doctorate degree in 1956 from the same faculty. She worked as a teacher, first at the high school and then later at the University of Zadar. She was interested in philosophy of science, logic, aesthetics, philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and of course on Croatian philosophy. One important philosopher and sociologist, but also one of the most prominent Croatian feminists, was Blaženka Despot. She was born in Zagreb in 1930, and she graduated philosophy and sociology and the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in Zagreb. In 1977, she received a doctoral degree at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. She worked at the Veterinary Medicine University in Zagreb, and she worked in the Institute of Social Research also in Zagreb. As I said before, she is important as a feminist. She introduced the feminist philosophy to the Croatian philosophers and students. The next Croatian philosopher I like to talk about was Zlata Knezović. She graduated Croatian Serbian language and literature, then later on philosophy and French language and literature at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in Zagreb. She received her doctorate degree in 1972 from the University of Strasbourg with a thesis L'éthique de l'existence chez Simone de Beauvoir. And she's important because she introduced Simone de Beauvoir to Croatian public, and that's the first book written about the reception of Simone de Beauvoir. It is also important that she wrote this book when Simone de Beauvoir was still alive, of course, and Simone de Beauvoir read this dissertation and find it very well composed. This dissertation of Zlatka Knezović will be published now this year. Luka and me are editors of this book. It will be published in French language as it was written. The next philosopher is Jerka Schiffer. She was born in literature at the University of Zagreb. She received her doctorate in philosophy with a thesis about, Luka mentioned him already, Nikola Vučetić, the husband of Maria Gondola. She was for many years editor-in-chief of the journal Contributions to the Research of Croatian Philosophy Heritage, and she also started and edited the journal Radovi Leksikografskog zavoda Miroslav Krleža. The next philosopher was also dealing with sociology and also was a prominent Croatian feminist. She died only 2 years ago. Her name is Gordana Bosanac, and she's born at the same city where I was born. So she's coming from my hometown. She's born in 1936. And because her father was Serbian, they had to move out of this city, Varaždin, and then they moved to some small villages to survive the Second War there. Her first job was at the Sociological Institute of Social Management, and she began her scientific career. Then later on, in 1967, the Faculty of Economics, University of Zagreb, she defended her doctoral dissertation. And then she worked from 1975 at the Faculty of Physical Education. She was there an assistant professor. And later on, she worked at the Institute of Social Research, also in Zagreb. She was a very fruitful writer, and of course, she died in 2019 in Zagreb. I will start now talking about Bulgarian women philosophers. I try to be engaged as more as I can in Bulgarian women philosophers. So I will first introduce to you Julia Kristeva. She was born in 1941, and she's currently working in the Paris. She will become influential in international critical analysis, cultural studies, and feminists after publishing her first book, Semiotike. This book was published in 1969. Kristeva is also the founder of the Simone de Beauvoir Prize Committee. The second Bulgarian woman philosopher is a woman who has similar name as me, Ivanka Rajnova. She was born in 1959. She lives and works still in Sofia. And except being a philosopher, she's also a prominent feminist, and she translates from different languages. The next philosopher is coming from Romania, and her name is Mihaela Miroiu. I hope I pronounced it well. She was born in 1955. She's a prominent feminist philosopher. She's currently professor of political science at the Faculty of Political Sciences, National University of Political Studies and Public Administration in Bucharest, in Romania. The second Romanian philosopher that I like to introduce to you is Marta Petreu. She's also born in 1955. Except being a prominent philosopher, she's essayist, poet, and literary critic. Now I will be talking about a Macedonian philosopher. Macedonia used to be a part of Yugoslavia at the time, and Katarina Kolozova was born in 1969, and she's a Macedonian academic, author, and philosopher. She's a director of and professor of gender studies and philosophy at the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities in Skopje. Skopje is the capital of Macedonia, and the professor of the University American College Skopje in Macedonia. Well, her most prominent book is The Death and the Greeks, on the philosophical and traditional concepts of death in ancient Greek. This book was published in 2000. I already talked about Serbian philosopher Ksenija Timošević and about Slovenian philosopher Alma Sodnik, so it's only right to talk a little bit more about Bosnian philosophers, women philosophers. When I'm talking about women philosophers, in Bosnia, well, it's a little bit complicated. The country, as you know, are divided into parts. And I found only one woman philosopher working at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in Sarajevo. Sarajevo is capital of the Federation. And her name is Jana Rahić. She is assistant professor dealing with ancient philosophy. So I will stop my talk here. I will end now. So.